Hello and welcome to Daily News Simplified. Here we have taken the important articles and the news clippings that has featured in the daily edition of the Hindu newspaper. The articles and the topics for the discussion are listed on your screen. On your screen is the question of the day. Try to answer the question in the stipulated word limit. The topic is discussed in today's DNS only, that is the 5th May. Try to answer the question in stipulated word limit and submit your answers on the ELEARN platform of RAU'S IAS to get it evaluated from the expert evaluators at RAU'S IAS. Moving on to the first article of the day, the article has featured on page 9 of the Hindu and basically highlights a debate surrounding that the CCTV cameras, whether they protect us or invade our privacy. Now, usually we take up the issues that are featured in the newspaper and analyze the ethical issues that are involved in the case or the ethical dilemmas that the particular news article represents. Now, this article debate is surrounding the privacy. We have analyzed this topic from the perspective of UPSC examination, under which the ethics GS4 has given for case study. In this discussion, we'll have a look at the previous year question paper and the case study that was presented in 2018 regarding the case of Edward Snowden, a computer expert and the former CIA administrator who had released confidential government documents to the press about the existence of government surveillance program. Basically, something related to the privacy of the people at large. We'll try to understand how should this type of case study be approached in the examination. Now, to answer this case study, basically, we'll follow the framework of the intro, body, and the conclusion. In the intro part, we'll write about the issues that are being highlighted in the case. That what are the challenges that this case presents. For example, in the introduction, we'll write that this case presents a critical case of dilemma to choose between professional conduct versus the ethical conscience. So this is what we'll write in the intro, that the Edward Snowden case represents a particular case of professional conduct where it is duty bound under the professional conduct to not report matters, but the ethical conscience of Edward Snowden led him to the revelation of snooping activities that were conducted by the government of the day. Now, after the introduction, we'll write about the body. The body will include 2 to 3 points that will be in the favor of Edward Snowden action and 2 to 3 points that will be opposing the Edward Snowden's action. And in the conclusion, we'll write a generalized conclusion to deal with such a problem on national or global level. Now, in such cases, it is very important to highlight the negatives as well as the positive of the action taken. Now, the first argument for the Snowden's action that can be taken is the argument of moral obligation. Edward Snowden had argued that he had a moral obligation to the act as he believed that the government was violating the right to privacy, an invasion of privacy, and it has to be exposed regardless of the legality that was involved in the case. For example, the Espionage Act. Because this was not only the breach of privacy, but it can also be highlighted that we have also discussed in the earlier case study that it is a breach of social contract between the people and the government itself. It destabilizes the legitimacy of the government if the government is indulged in mass scale surveillance and invading the privacy of people. So the moral obligation towards people at large was one of the reasons to support the Edward Snowden action of whistleblowing. The second point that can be given regarding supporting the action of Edward Snowden is the issue of public interest. Now, the action taken by Snowden were in the public interest at large, as he exposed the government surveillance programs which are a threat to the privacy as well as the other civil liberties. And it also justifies the criteria of greatest good of the greatest number. Also, this also highlights that the Edward Snowden, while taking the action of exposing the government actions, was also guided by the values of or the virtues of empathy and compassion towards the fellow citizens. And the third reason that can be used to justify Edward Snowden's action is the whistleblower protection. Now, whistleblowers need to be protected as there is a general view that whistleblowers are individuals who expose the illegal and the unethical practices of the organization or the state at large. They highlight the illegal or the unethical practices which will hamper the interest of people at large. And thus it can be concluded that the values of empathy and compassion and the moral obligations, the morality. And while answering, we can also mention a quote used by Mahatma Gandhi that morality is the basis for everything and truth is the substance of morality. So thereby highlighting of the actual activities of the government and speaking the truth, Edward Snowden actions can be justified. But at the same time, we have to look about the arguments that are against the Snowden's action. The first is the violation of law. Now, though ethically we have tried to justify Snowden action, but the course of action taken by Edward Snowden broke the law by leaking the confidential government documents to the press. And as per the legal experts, it violated the Espionage Act of 1971 of the US. And this leaking of state specific information or the state secrets is to be treated as an act of treason. The second argument against the Snowden's action is that it compromised the national security and put the people at risk. It compromised the national security as it made aware for the terrorists as well as the other organized criminals about the techniques that have been employed by the government of the day and thus compromise the national security of people at large. Because this technology was also used for legitimate purpose to protect and safeguard the interest of citizens at large. So thus the greatest good of also being saved through this surveillance activities. And the third argument against Edward Snowden's action was the lack of accountability on his part. The whistleblowing activity which he has conducted means that the Edward Snowden must be held accountable for his action, as this will set a dangerous precedent wherein anyone could break the law, feeling that they have the moral obligation to do so. And this will create a sense of anarchy in the state as people will begin to lose their hope with the functioning of the state. Thus, the very basis of organization of state can be threatened through this action. So at the last, we can conclude by saying that in this case, the consequences of the act of Edward Snowden should be the criteria to judge the ethicality of his action. Thus, we have tried to write a balanced answer regarding this case study. Moving on to the next article of the day, the article has appeared on page 1 of the Hindu and basically talks about the meeting between the External Affairs Minister of India, that is S. Jaishankar, with his Chinese counterpart, Xin Gang. Now, the meeting between the two foreign ministers was primarily focused on the unresolved 3-year-old military standoff on the line of actual control. Apart from that, External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar also met with the Russian Foreign Minister and the Uzbekistan Foreign Minister also at the Foreign Minister Summit of SCO. Through this article, we will try to understand the border issue between India and that of China. Why there is a border issue between the two countries, that is between India and China. What has been the genesis of this border dispute? What have been the causes of the recent escalations of the border dispute in the current time? Why there is an escalation of border dispute between India and China at the line of actual current recently? And at the last, we'll also try to suggest some of the way that can be adopted by both the countries as a method to solve or dislodge the problem of border issue. Now, this topic becomes important because in the GS2 syllabus, bilateral relations of India are mentioned. And the two governments, that is the Indian and Chinese armies, in the past have conducted 18 rounds of military talks to end the border war. Now the border dispute has been apparent and is primarily divided into the western and the eastern sector. Now the border dispute between India and China on western and eastern front is important because recently China released a statement and included a map that showed 11 places renamed by China as being within the Zhangan or the southern Tibet in the Chinese. Thereby, not only in the western region which comprises of the Ladakh area, the eastern region or the eastern sector of India-Chinese border is also contested. Now, through this infographic, we will try to understand the border dispute in brief. Now, the India-China shares a border of roughly 3,500 km, and the border between India and China is not demarcated, and there is no mutually agreed line of control between the two countries. Now the entire border is divided between the two sectors, that is the western sector, the central sector or the middle sector, and the eastern sector. The middle sector is considered to be largely settled and peaceful, though with occasional intrusions from the Chinese side. But the western sector and the eastern sector remains contested between the two countries. And the primary reason that is highlighted by China here is that China claims that the border agreement signed was between the British India and Tibet was under the colonial pressure to sign that agreement. So the border agreement that was signed earlier is not applicable on China. In the western sector, the problem basically arises from the boundary line that separates the Ladakh region. Now, this Ladakh region is separated from the Xinjiang province of China. India accuses China of illegally occupying the Aksai Chin area, and China sees this Aksai Chin as an extension of Tibetan Plateau, wherein the India claims that Aksai Chin is an extension of the Ladakh Plateau. Now, Aksai Chin is important not only for India but also for China, as it connects the two backward provinces of China, that is Tibet and Xinjiang, with the mainland China. Further, the British here drew line. The first line is the Johnson line. Now, if India goes by the Johnson line, Aksai Chin is to be considered as the part of India, meaning thereby Johnson line advocates Aksai Chin to be part of India, that is of Kashmir. And the other line is of McDonald line, which China claims, and this will put Aksai Chin under the Xinjiang province. And as a result of disagreement which prevails between India claiming the Johnson line and China claiming the McDonald line, there is no resolution of this problem. Currently, the line of actual control separates India and China in the absence of any mutually agreed boundaries. But thus, as there is no mutually agreed body, there is a difference of perception about the alignment of the line. In the eastern sector, on the other hand, there is presence of McMahon line. Now, the eastern sector was delineated in the year of 1914, wherein the Simla Conference took place and British India, China and Tibet took part in it. Under this Simla Conference, British proposed outer Tibet, that is bordering India, and inner Tibet, that is bounding China. And a boundary was created which demarcated the Tibetan region of China and northeast frontier areas of India, that is currently known as the Arunachal Pradesh. And both the leaders agreed upon, that is the British and the Tibetan representatives agreed upon in establishing the McMahon line. But China has not recognized the McMahon line. It says that the McMahon line was agreed between the British and the Tibet. And as a result, China claims that entire Arunachal Pradesh, especially the part of Tawang, as the part of Tibet. Whereas, on the other hand, India considers McMahon line to be an official line of boundary between India and China. So, a difference of opinion due to the colonial history and the colonial demarcation of boundary lines is the cause of problem between the two countries. We have seen the cause of problem in the western sector regarding the interpretation of Johnson and the McDonald line as per the conveniences and geostrategic importance by both the countries. And also in the eastern sector, we have seen that how McMahon Line, though favored by India, is not agreeable to China as it considers that the Shimla Conference that took place in 1914, of which it was not a part because it was not a sovereign state at that point of time, and was agreed by the Tibetan rulers. Now, this brings us to the next question, that what are the reasons of escalations of problem along the LAC today? Why there is a rise in escalations of border dispute at the line of actual control today? The first reason that has been highlighted by the scholars is the distraction. Now, China has escalated the intrusion efforts, and it was seen during the Galwan clash also, to distract the world from the COVID-19 crisis, of which China was considered as responsible for. Further, the process is also important because it represents the India's political rhetoric. Now it is seen, or the escalations at the LAC are seen as a reaction to the India's political rhetoric regarding the Aksai Chin area. And this came after India has abrogated Article 370 and reorganized Jammu and Kashmir. So to counter the political rhetoric of India regarding the Aksai Chin, China has come along with the increased intrusion efforts in the LAC area. Now, third reason that can be highlighted of increasing the escalation along the LAC is the infrastructural development that is taking place. Now, the infrastructural development conducted by India, especially with regard to the DSDBO road, that is the Darbuk Shayok Daulat Beg Oldie road, has been not going well with China, and this infrastructure development by the Indian side has brought out frustration from the Chinese side. The next cause of escalation along the LAC is the geostrategic importance. Now, this area is very important because of geostrategic location, as it passes through the area of CPEC. India has said that CPEC violates the sovereignty of India, but this is of importance for China to gain strategic edge vis-a-vis India. Now, next reason can be highlighted as a Chinese rise under the Xi Jinping. Now, China under Xi Jinping has moved away from the era of peaceful rise, rather than it has gone for asserting itself as the next superpower. So, from the era of peaceful rise toward the era of assertion as the next superpower has been the political strategy of China under Xi Jinping. Now, the next reason that can be highlighted is the Chinese aspiration of asserting itself as a superpower. And this has been reflected not only with the border incursions in the LAC area, but also with the COVID-19 crackdown in the China itself, and also with the crackdown that has happened in the Hong Kong in the recent years. Further, cost effectiveness is also highlighted as the step taken by China on the LAC. Because of the limited scope of the military expedition on the contested border, it is cost effective for the Chinese military, as such skirmishes will never promote or full scale military response from India, and is also very easy for the ever growing conventional superiority of military that China has vis-a-vis India. And the last reason that has been asserted for this dramatic rise in the escalations along LAC is the India's tilt towards America. Now, India over the world has been seen as tilting towards the United States of America. And this tilt has been perceived negatively by China. There is a convergence of Indian and American interest in the Indo-Pacific region especially. India has also a part of the Quad group. India is in negotiating terms to become part of the G7 grouping. And India also has clear-cut policy stance against China with regard to the Belt and Road Initiative, as it is the only Asian country which reject the Belt and Road Initiative, and thus India's tilt towards America, aligned with the mutual hostilities between India and China that are currently present, highlights the case wherein China has undertook the role of limited military action against India, which has been testified by the increasing border skirmishes and intrusions both in the eastern and the western sector. So this brings us to the last part of our discussion, that what can be suggested as the way forward. From the discussion, it is clear that it is not only the territorial claim by China but also the geopolitical factors globally and the aligning of interest between the superpower of United States of America and that of India, which is leading to the increased border skirmish. And thus this border dispute resolution will take a lot of efforts, and therefore the Indian government needs to adopt the steps wherein it must recognize the impact of a carefully crafted and argumentatively strong statement and not limit itself to a reactionary defensive position. For example, when the Galwan clash took place and said that the Chinese claim over the Galwan Valley is truly misplaced and highlighted the historical position of India. But it did not substantiate its historical claim with any document. On the other hand, China has worked aggressively to establish the historical link by using its think tank. So there is a need to carefully draft and bring out an argumentatively strong statement rather than being a reactionary state. Further, the second step that India can take is to end the dearth of experts on international law in India. These international law experts can counter the Chinese interpretations. Thus, inclusion of experts on international law will help incorporate a national perspective of international law instead of blindly adhering to the Western norms. And further, at the last, India needs to expand its think tanks and their scope and include the experts on the international law under it. Not only will they provide a knowledge-based and well-researched expert opinion on any topic, but the informal character of these think tanks can also provide government with an alternative narrative, allowing it to make indirect assertion, claims and counterclaims that could be difficult for Indian government to take as an official stand. Thus, the appointment and the expansion of scope of the think tanks, hiring of experts on international law, and the need for a strong and carefully crafted and argumentatively strong statement is the need for the hour to address the border issues between India and China. With this article, we have seen why there is a border dispute in western and the eastern sector along the India-China border, and why there has been an escalation along the border disputes. Moving on to the next article of the day, the article has featured on page 10 of the Hindu and basically talks about the reasons behind the Manipur's widespread unrest. Now this topic is important from the GS2 perspective, as this article will give us details about the Manipur ethnic composition and the arguments laid by the Metis community and other tribal groups that are protesting against the ST status for the Metis. Further, through this article, we will also try to analyze that what basically are scheduled tribes, their constitutional provisions, the criteria for the inclusions in the scheduled tribe list, as well as we will also try to understand what has been a demand of the Metis from the past. Now, the particular article talks about the large-scale violence that broke out in Manipur after the Manipur High Court's direction to state to pursue a 10-year-old recommendation which is granting the ST status to the non-tribal Metis community. Now, what has happened in Manipur is that violent clashes have erupted during a tribal solidarity march which was organized by all tribal student unions. And the purpose of this tribal solidarity march was to oppose the inclusion of Metis community in the state's scheduled tribes list. In a response to this violent clashes, the army and the Assam Rifles have now conducted flag marches in the affected areas, as there have been strong opposition to the orders made by the High. Now when we have seen the case, let us try to understand more about the scheduled tribes. Now the Constitution of India under Article 366 prescribes that the scheduled tribes are the tribes or the tribal communities that are deemed under Article 342 of the Indian Constitution to be qualified as scheduled tribe. And the Article 342 talks that President may, with respect to any state or UT, after the consultation with the governor by a public notification, can specify the tribes or the tribal communities as scheduled tribes in relation to the state or the UTs. So it is to remember, if it can be asked in prelims examination also, that it is the president in consultation with the governor by public notification specifying the tribes or the tribal communities as the scheduled tribe. Further, the clause 2 of Article 342 says that Parliament may by law include or even exclude from the list of scheduled tribes that are specified in a notification. So, Article 342 gives power to the President in consultation with the governor, but the clause 2 of Article 342 also gives the power to the Parliament to by law determine the inclusion or exclusion from the list of scheduled tribes. Now we have seen the constitutional provision regarding the scheduled tribe. We'll try to understand the process of inclusion in the scheduled tribes list. The first thing to understand here is that constitution basically silent about the criteria for specification of a community as a scheduled tribe, meaning thereby there are no provisions regarding the criteria for the inclusion into the scheduled tribe as in the constitution. As the constitution is silent, the criteria presently followed for the specification of a community as a scheduled tribe are indication of having primitive traits, distinctive culture being followed by them, the tribes living in the geographical isolation from the world, shyness of the contact with the community at large, and existing backwardness. So these are the 5 criteria that are being currently used for a community to be included under the scheduled tribes. That includes primitive traits, backwardness, shyness, geographical isolation, and following a distinctive culture. It is to be remembered that the constitution is silent regarding the criteria for inclusion. Now, another thing to understand about the ST or the scheduled tribes in India is that there are over 700 tribes with overlapping communities in India. And these have been notified under Article 342 of the Indian Constitution, which we have already discussed. These 700 tribes are spread over different states and the union territories, and Odisha is the state which has the largest number of tribal communities. Another thing to understand apart from the largest existence in Odisha is that the scheduled tribes are not present in the state of Haryana, Punjab, the UT of Chandigarh, Delhi, and Pondicherry. So this was all regarding the constitutional provision of scheduled tribes, the criteria for their inclusion, and some of the other facts related to the scheduled tribe and communities in India. Now we'll have a look towards the ethnic composition of the Manipur state, as the state in news is Manipur and the conflict that has erupted there. Now in Manipur, the Meiteis are now to be included as per the court order under the scheduled tribe communities. Meiteis are the largest community in the Manipur state, occupying 65% of the population. They are residing in the Central Valley. But though having 64% of the population and residing in the Central Valley itself only have a 10% of state landmass. And the 90% of the state comprises of the hills, where about 35% of the rest population stays. And this 35% of the population consists of 34 recognized tribes, which are known as any Kuki tribes or any Naga tribe. Now the demand of the Meitei community dates back to 2012, wherein the Scheduled Tribe Demand Committee of Manipur has been leading the effort to push for the Meitei community to be included under the list of scheduled tribe. So it is from the 2012 and the 10-year recommendation that has been now directed by the High Court to be implemented that asked for the inclusion of Meitei committee in the scheduled tribe list.
And it is in this regard that the Meitei Tribe Union approached the Manipur High Court seeking a direction to the state government and thus Meitei community to be included as a tribe among the tribes in Manipur. They highlighted that the Meitei community had been recognized a tribe before the merger of princely state of Manipur with the Union of India in 1949, but this identity was lost after the merger of Manipur with India. And the demand which has been led by the Manipur is to preserve the community, its ancestral land, the traditions, culture, language, as they have been victimized without any constitutional safeguards. And in the past also, the scheduled tribes demand community had made several pleas with both center as well as the state government, highlighting the gradual marginalization of the Meitei community. So now that we have seen what are the demands of Meitei community, wherein the prima facie rule that they have highlighted is that before the inclusion of Manipur in the Indian Union in 1949, they were recognized as a tribal community, but this tag was lost. And to preserve the culture, land, language, and the tradition, and further marginalization of the Meitei community, they need to be included under the scheduled tribe category. But at the same time, other tribal groups are also opposing the demand, and this is the reason for the violent clashes that have emerged. The tribal groups are concerned that granting the ST status to the Meiteis, who have a dominant population as well as the political representation, could result in the loss of job opportunities and affirmative action for the existing communities. And they highlight that owing to their larger population size, Meitei community do not need any kind of protection for their culture and identity, as they are already a dominant group and had the state support in safeguarding their cultural, political, as well as economic rights. So this was all about the case of Meitei community in Manipur and the violent clashes that have emerged. We have also seen in our discussion the criteria for the inclusion of scheduled tribes and the constitutional provision regarding the same, which is silent on the matter. And at the first, we have also seen the definition of scheduled tribes as given under the Indian Constitution. Moving on to the next article of the day, the article has featured on page 8 of the Hindu and basically talks about the recent challenges in the airline industry. Now, this article is important because it highlights the challenges that is in the airline industry. Further, this article becomes even more important if we see the present context of the airline industry. Now, in the recent times, two major developments have took place in the airline industry. The first major development was regarding the Air India. Now, the Tata Group owned Air India has placed a mega order of 470 aircrafts, and this was the largest order placed by any airline industry in one go anywhere in the world. And the second major development is the case of Go First Airline that has now filed for insolvency proceedings with the National Company Law Tribunal. Now, this case highlights the dwindling issues of the airline industry in India with respect to the earlier case like that of Jet Airways and the issue of defunct Kingfisher Airlines, and now with the issue of Go First. Through this article, we will try to understand the airline industry in India. Also, we will try to understand what is the challenges that the airline industry and the case of Go First will make for the airline industry in general. Also, we have seen that the Tata Group has recently placed an order. So we will see the prospects of airline industry in India. At the last, we will understand the government steps that have been taken in this regard and the way forward. Now, the GS3 section also talks about the infrastructure sector, which includes airports, and thus airline industry also becomes important from the perspective of the mains examination. Now, the first thing to understand is the challenges that this Go First airline failure will pose towards India. Now, the first is the impact on the operational creditors due to the insolvency proceedings. Now, the operational creditors will be affected more as the Go First is filing for bankruptcy, and they will be affected more than the financial creditors, as under the IBC, the financial creditors are accorded a higher priority. So the operational creditors are likely to face more worth of this recent bankruptcy. The second thing that this Go First airline case will create is the increase in NPAs or the non-performing asset for the financial institutions. Now, Go First has recently borrowed a sum of 1200 plus crore rupees under the government's emergency credit scheme. Now, the total liabilities of all creditors, including dues of banks, financial institutions, and etc., range close to 11,000 crore rupees. So, the failure of the Go First Airlines will further increase the NPA pressure on the financial institution in general. The next impact that the bankruptcy of Go First Airline will cause is the demand supply gap. Now, the fares in the airline industry is already very high. As the Go First Airlines have been taken off the grid, in the immediate near term, the cancelled flights and the customers will go to other airlines, and this will create increased demand for a decreased supply of total number of seats that are available with the other airlines, and thus can further boost the fare prices. Now, a major challenge that is crucial for all the airlines and not only the Go First case is the rising cost of aviation turbine fuel. Now, the aviation turbine fuel is important because it occupies 40% of the total operational costs, and this aviation turbine fuel impacts their financial viability. And in the recent part, it has been seen that the ATF, that is the aviation turbine fuel, has been consistently rising, and thus it has not only put stress on the Go First Airlines but is putting stress on the balance sheet of all the airlines. Another issue that the airline industry today faces is the cuts in the corporate travel budget. Now, due to the fear of global recession and geopolitical turmoils around the world, the corporate travel budget has been estimated by the international financial institutions to go down in 2023. And this corporate travel budget was a major chunk of revenue for the airline industry. And with the risk of global recession and the geopolitical turmoils happening around the world, the corporate travel budget is expected to decline, which will further decrease the profit margins of airline industry. Now, this is to remember that the airline industry already runs on a very thin profit margin. Next challenge that the airline industry today faces is the issue of skill shortage. Now, there is a shortage and gaps in the industry recognized skills from airline pilots and crew or to the maintenance of the ground staff or the MRO operation. And this shortage of the required skills or the industry recognized skill create further challenges for the airline industry. The last challenge that the airline industry in India faces is the lack of big airports or the airports in general, like that of large hubs in Singapore or Dubai. And this inhibits airlines from India to becoming a truly global network carrier. So these are the challenges that the bankruptcy of the Go First Airlines and the airline industry in particular faces. Now that we have seen the challenges, we will also try to analyze why the demand of airline industry has been increasing in India and what are the prospects of growth for the airline industry in India. Now, the first thing to understand here is that India is stated to become the third largest aviation market in terms of passenger by 2024. And India has continuously witnessed a year-on-year growth when it comes to the domestic passenger traffic. Further, India has also announced the expansion of the airport network, which is to be increased from the current 129 functional airports to the level of 200 plus airports in the coming years. So this highlights a sweet spot for India. The other advantages that India has in the airline industry is the robust demand. The first robust demand is the rising middle class and the working group. Now the widening of this middle class topography and the working group is expected to boost the demand of airlines or the air travel in India, and thus is a beneficial opportunity for the airline industry. Now the next advantage that the India has in terms of airline industry is the opportunities in the maintenance, repair and the overall sector, that is the MRO operations. Now it is estimated by the government facts that the MRO industry is likely to become a $2 billion industry by 2028. And the government of India is also pushing for making India a global MRO hub and has also brought in changes in the land allotment for the MRO facilities, wherein the land allotment rate has been changed for a period of 30 years from the current 3 to 5 years. Next thing that is favorable for the case of Indian airline industry is the policy support. Now, what has been done in the recent time is that the FDI limit has been increased, and now FDI up to a level of 49% is allowed under the automatic route. Secondly, what has happened that government has also lowered the custom duty to 0% on components or parts that include engines, manufacturing of aircrafts by the public sector units, etc. The next thing that is favorable for India in the airline industry is the increasing investment in this sector. Now, investment is bound to increase in the Indian airport structure. There is a growing private sector participation and public-private partnership is happening. And as per the data released by the Department of Promotion of Industry and Internal Trade, that is the DPIIT, the FDI inflow in India in the airline sector has been consistently increasing. Now that we have discussed that why India has been placed at an advantageous position, we'll look at what are the recent steps that the government has already taken. Now, whenever we try to prepare any sector or any industry, we'll try to understand it in a simpler manner. The first thing to understand is the place in the sector. So we have seen that the airline industry is set to become the third largest passenger industry by 2024 and has seen a year-on-year growth in the air travel as well as setting up of new airports. Secondly, we have seen what are the challenges that the airline industry in particular faces. Also, with the recent bankruptcy of Go First, what are the other challenges that the airline industry will face? Next, we have discussed why there is a sweet spot for India or why Indian airline industry is at a better stage. Next, we'll see what are the government steps that have already been taken, and at the last, we will recommend some of the way forward. And it is in this format that we have to write our main answer also. So the government step that has been taken in this regard is the budgetary support. Now, the budgetary support has been provided in 2022-23 budget also, wherein close to 10,000 crore rupees were provided for the Ministry of Civil Aviation. Further, the schemes like Regional Connectivity Scheme or the UDAN scheme and the PM Gati Shakti Vision has also been launched in order to promote airports in the country. Government in the past has also announced the National Civil Aviation Policy of 2016, and this has been launched in order to make air travel affordable as well as to increase the connectivity. Further, government in the recent time have also taken some of the tax rationalization efforts wherein the GST or the goods and service tax for the MRO services has been reduced from 18% previously to a level of 5% presently. So a tax rationalization exercise has also been taken by the government in the recent times. Government in the past has launched the Regional Connectivity Scheme or the UDAN, that is Ude Desh Ke Aam Nagrik. And under this, more than 1 crore passengers have availed the benefit of UDAN flight. Government in the recent time has also launched Krishi UDAN, and the scheme lays out the vision for realization through better integration and optimization of agri-harvesting. Government is also moving for monetization of assets, as the Airport Authority of India has introduced joint ventures in 7 airports and has entered into the PPP mode, that is the public-private partnership, for their operation, management and development. Further, government has also earmarked 25 airports that are presently under the control of Airport Authority of India for their asset monetization. Further, the Airport Authority of India has also introduced a startup policy wherein interaction with the internal and the external stakeholders will take place that can be used to promote innovations and leverage technology for addressing the challenges related to the delivery of services to the passengers. So now that we have seen what the government steps have been taken in the recent time, the last is the way forward. The way forward suggested is to take in account the stakeholders. The industry stakeholders should engage and collaborate with policymakers to implement efficient and rational decisions. Secondly, there should be a need of focus on the quality, cost, and the passenger interest. So, there is a need to address these challenges in order to make the airline industry more profitable, and along with the steps that have been taken by the government in the recent past and the steps like monetization of assets proposed by government in the future, the airline industry can turn around and attain the space of becoming the third largest aviation market. So with this, we have seen the airline industry, the challenges that the recent bankruptcy will pose, the prospects for the airline industry in India, the government steps that have been taken in this regard.